Are they reliable? Are they survivable? Are they accurate? Are they secure? Things like that.
Yeah, we can hear you very well right now. So you can have a starting your question.
Winter, I don't know how you want to do this, if you want to do some Q&A or you want me to talk a little bit about some of the inherent risks in critical infrastructure. So I'm open to sort of the format here.
Casey, I think it would be wonderful if we could start with you talking about some of the inherent risks to critical infrastructure, and then we can do some Q&A at the end.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Appreciate it.
I guess a disclaimer. I'm relatively new to critical infrastructure. I've spent the better part of the past 25 plus years working at the intersection of information technology and information security, or what it gets lumped under now as part of cybersecurity, both in the higher ed space, but also doing a lot of commercial work. I guess you could say I'm a scholarly practitioner. And I joined the University of Illinois, the Information Trust Institute, about a year and a half ago. And so, what's interesting and sort of the perspective I'll bring today as somebody who's new to critical infrastructure security, and learning about the differences between the work I was doing on the information technology and cybersecurity side, and how some of that relates and is absolutely wildly different than the way in which things are done, and the business drivers and the other sorts of big differences on the critical infrastructure, what we call the operational technology side of the house. So first off, just critical infrastructure. Essentially, critical infrastructure are those things that are required for essentially a functioning civil society. And there are, I think, 16 of them that have been defined by the Department of Homeland Security. And they include things like telecommunications and finance and banking and oil and gas and electricity, wastewater, drinking water, transportation, dams, etc., transportation. So there's 16 of these critical infrastructure. And so when we talk about critical infrastructure writ large, it's those sorts of things that a society needs to maintain the reliability and security and availability of in order to have a functioning civil society. And there are big differences between the systems that are used to provide and maintain the availability and reliability of these critical infrastructure systems versus the sort of differences between the systems that are used in more on sort of the data information technology side. And sort of understanding these differences is really important because it impacts how we might respond to an incident. So what do I mean by that? So for example, there are differences in terms of business drivers between organizations that manage operational technologies versus organizations that use information technology. The biggest business drivers are the number one priority in operational technology systems is reliability and safety, really. Safety number one, reliability number two, or availability, right? You could sort of maybe safety, availability / reliability are the number one drivers. The drivers of an organization relying solely on information technologies is perhaps maybe the data itself, right, is the most important thing. And then perhaps maybe the confidentiality of that data. Make sure that only those people that can access that data can access that, no more, no less. Certainly the availability of data is important, but it's not maybe necessarily the number one business driver, right? And so that's super important as we think about sort of taking lessons learned from ways in which we can secure IT systems, right? We need to understand these sort of subtle differences between what are the business drivers and how do we secure IT systems, and what of those things can we apply to the operational technology side of the house and what can't we? Other big differences between sort of IT and operational technology systems are typically the life cycle of the systems, right? And so what's meant by that is the life cycle of a system is the procuring of the system and the installation and the maintenance and any upgrades, and then the ultimate decommissioning of that system, right? Those are the elements of a life cycle of a system. Well, in organizations that support critical infrastructure, those life cycle of their systems that support whatever their critical infrastructure is, they're measured in 15, 20 years, right? In some cases, there are systems that are maybe 25, 30 years old, right? And so these systems are around much longer versus the life cycle on the information technology side of the house is typically 1-3 years, right? And so you're replacing equipment more often on the IT side of the house than you are on the OT side of the house. And so this can present some challenges when you're talking about, for example, things like trying to secure OT systems, right? You know, what are the ways in which you can secure systems that are 20, 25 years old when perhaps the vendor doesn't even support those systems anymore, right? And so having an understanding just of, you know, the difference of the life cycles also really, really important when thinking about how we secure systems. Operational technology operators, they tend to be more like mechanical and electrical engineers than computer cybersecurity people, right? This is a big differentiator, right? So, you know, oftentimes there's also a different chain of reporting. So in information technology, it's typically the people within IT reporting to a chief information officer or a chief information security officer or a chief technical officer. But in operational technology groups within these organizations that support critical infrastructure, it's often a shift supervisor that reports to a plant manager that reports to a chief operating officer. And it sort of makes sense when you think about what's being controlled, right? In IT, what's being controlled is data, but in operational technology, what's being controlled is some sort of physical process, right? Some sort of a valve or some sort of a pump or some sort of a device that opens and closes to allow gasoline to be distributed from Texas to Maryland, for example, right? So that's an important distinction. As I mentioned in OT, the real sort of desired system characteristics are safety, reliability, and controllability. The desired system characteristics for information technology systems are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality being defined as only the people that need to access data can. Integrity means that when people do access that data, that it's accurate. And availability means the data is available and when people need it, right? And so those are big distinctions in terms of just desired system characteristics. I mentioned life cycle, right? OT systems are created to last as long as possible without upgrades and patches, right? And so operational technology environments, they're relatively static, and oftentimes the requirements don't change very often. And upgrades of those operational technology systems happen during specific operational maintenance periods, right? Imagine you deliver electricity to a neighborhood, right? So there'll be specific operational maintenance periods where equipment will have to be upgraded or whatever, right? Repaired, right? And you need to continue to provide that service, in this case, electricity, right? And as I mentioned, the OT, operational technology systems, have a life cycle in the 15 to 20 years versus the 3 to 5 of IT. Some other big differences between IT and OT systems and networks, they may be managed or installed by IT hobbyists within a small business, right? And so they may not, unlike larger organizations that have a critical role in providing these critical infrastructure services, they may be actual industrial engineers or people who went to college to actually study how to implement, install, and manage these systems. Remote management is required for operators and vendors of most OT systems. And I'll come back to that one if we have some time to talk about some recent attacks. It relates to an incident outside of Tampa, Florida, where there was some remote management software used to manage systems that dealt with the treatment of wastewater, and some vulnerabilities or weaknesses in that remote management software. And there's a lot of discussions around, sort of piling on or going after this small utility that was managing wastewater, outside of Tampa. But the reality is that for most operational technology systems, remote management is absolutely required for operators and vendors. And so how you provide, how you go about making sure those systems are secure and safe is really important. You can't simply just say, well, no, vendors and operators, no remote access is not, that's just unfortunately not an option. Let's see, what are some other differences? And then we can talk a little bit about, I'll stop and answer any questions. OT folks have, as I mentioned, different business priorities and culture. So what are some good examples there? OT is about keeping systems stable and avoiding changes, versus in the IT world, it's all about constant change, right? Let's see, some others. I think that's a good start. I'll stop there. I didn't really get into any of the risk stuff yet, Winter. I just wanted to sort of set the stage and sort of share some of what I've learned transitioning into critical infrastructure, right? Leveraging an IT security background and learning these differences and how some of these differences, it's really, first, really important just to understand them so you can talk intelligently with people on the operational technology side of the house. But two, you can't always take the lessons learned and the things that are effective in securing systems and making them available and making sure that the data, for example, is accurate. You can't always apply those same techniques when you're talking about operational technology systems. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions before sort of going on.
Thank you so much, Casey. Does anyone have any questions so far?
No, hearing none. Should I continue, Winter?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Casey.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk a little bit about risk, and we can talk about some specific examples. There's a lot of recent examples that can highlight some of these risks. So risk, first of all, I'm talking about the possibility that something could happen to either damage, destroy, or disclose data and or other resources, for example. It usually requires some assessment of the probability or the possibility or the chance that that this event could happen. And essentially, the more likely there is that a threat will occur, the greater the risk, right? And so when we talk about risk in terms of cybersecurity, it's a sort of its own discipline, if you will. When you think about sort of the elements of security in organizations, managing risk is usually a major part of that. It usually falls in the domain called governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. And there tend to be people who specialize in risk, right? They specialize in doing things called threat modeling, right? Which is, understanding for example, I'm at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. It's a large research institution, a lot of grant funding, a lot of, important people, dignitaries, heads of state visit. There's a lot of research that's done. There's huge compute resources, supercomputers, clusters of supercomputer systems, really fast internet connections, right? And so there's obviously personally identifiable information in the way of, student records and financial finances are collected, right? People, pay to go to the university. So these are all the sorts of things that the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has. And any risk management profile or any risk management program that is good ones and mature ones will think about, well, what are the what are the things that we have at the University of Illinois? And I just listed some. And then, so, those are the things that bad actors might want. And if we had to prioritize those in terms of what's most important, how would we rank those? And then once we have them ranked, then there's feedback, might mute themselves. There we go. So once we have them ranked, then we can start to think about appropriate defenses for those things that we have that bad actors may want. That's an example, very simple example of threat modeling, right? But, it's a part of this overall risk management for an organization. So that's what I mean by risk. And so let's talk about some of the risks to critical infrastructure systems. And there are a number of them. There are operational risks, which involve the operations, whatever it is, if it's treating wastewater or delivering natural gas or oil or gasoline via a pipeline, or it's electricity, or it's making sure that you can safely fly from from Seattle, Washington to Victoria, British Columbia, whatever the critical infrastructure is, they have operations, and right, and there are risks that perhaps can bring those operations down, which impacts the ability of the organization to perform its mission. There are safety risks, right? This would be things like physical harm or death to employees and other people nearby. If there's some sort of storm that causes some electrical equipment to become damaged, and that electrical equipment is near water, right? There are safety risks, and there are safety risks perhaps in even working with these critical infrastructure systems. I mentioned this Tampa wastewater incident, and it was Oldsmar, Florida. It's a small city sort of near Tampa, and the municipality has they treat the wastewater. When you flush the toilet or wash your dishes, right? All it goes to a central location, and they treat that wastewater. And what happened was a technician who was sitting in front of his computer. He's got software that's used to automatically, but also manually treat that water. They'll use chemicals and they'll put a certain amount of chemicals in that water to treat that water so it can be reused for other purposes. Well, as the technician was sitting at his computer, he noticed that his mouse started moving on his screen, but he wasn't actually moving his mouse. And he realized that somebody using remote software that they make available to their vendors and operators, I mentioned that earlier, that's an absolute requirement for most critical infrastructure systems. Somebody had actually taken over, they were able to actually get into that remote management software and start to move the mouse around. And they actually started to make changes, right? They actually started to they make changes to that wastewater treatment system, increase the amount of the chemical used to treat the water. Fortunately, the operator happened to be at his computer. He saw this, was able to kick that person out, right? And also, fortunately, there are other sorts of more manual processes that would preclude somebody from trying to go in and increase the type of chemical used to treat water, which, beyond certain levels can be fatal to humans. So, I mentioned that reliability and safety are number 1 and 2 business drivers for critical infrastructure operators. And so, but imagine that there weren't some sort of manual process in place. Imagine that somebody could, in fact, remotely access a system at a wastewater treatment facility and increase the levels of some sort of chemical beyond a threshold that's safe. And then that gets in the drinking water of a population in an area and people get sick, right? People die. Those are real risks of the sort of safety variety. There are environmental risks, right? This could be toxic physical harm to land or waterways or animals or foliage or people. There's risks to equipment, there are financial risks, and certainly national security risks. And this has absolutely really been highlighted in the past couple of years because of COVID, namely just supply chain disruptions, right? That have led to, challenges with, sort of basics in some cases, right? So baby formula, toilet paper, right? But these continue to be these supply chain challenges, right? They certainly can affect food and drinking water and heat and fuel and electricity. And then, of course, laced throughout all of this are cybersecurity risks. And I mentioned the one in Oldsmar, Florida, but there was another highly visible, talked about a lot. You probably heard about it, that sort of looks at this intersection of risks and the differences between IT and OT systems. And that was the Colonial pipeline attack. You may have heard about this. So Colonial pipeline is a thousands mile long actual 4-foot pipeline that goes from Texas up to the eastern seaboard, sort of Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. And hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline are pushed through that 4-foot pipeline every single day. And what happened was interesting, right? So one of the things you're seeing more and more of is IT systems are being connected to traditional operational technology systems. This has been happening over the past decade or so. Prior to that, these systems were effectively separate for lots of reasons. One, just safety reasons. But as newer and newer technologies that are used in the operational technology side of the house are bought and installed and implemented, these devices have things like internet connectivity and whatnot. And so you're seeing this sort of over the past 10 years, this convergence of IT and OT systems. All right. And so what happened with the Colonial pipeline was not an attack of the computers and the systems that actually literally moved the hundreds of thousands of gallons of gas. On the on the IT side of the house, there was a system had been compromised, and it affected the systems that they use for enterprise resource planning, ERP, which is used for things like payroll, accounts payable, accounts receivable, managing customers, and specifically the Colonial Pipeline ERP system managed which customers got what amount of gasoline in a given day. And so out of an abundance of caution, what Colonial Pipeline decided to do was they knew that their systems had been compromised on the IT side. They weren't really sure about the systems on the OT side. So they shut those systems down out of an abundance of caution. The OT systems were not compromised, but because the IT and OT systems are ever connected, if you will, and more connected, right? They shut down the OT side of the house, those systems that manage the pumping of gasoline across this thousands-mile long pipeline. And it had huge disruptions, especially in the Washington, D.C., sort of Baltimore area, where much of that gasoline was going to service Baltimore Washington International Airport, for example. And it caused this sort of, these nuanced subtleties, right? The difference between the compromise happened on systems on an information technology network, and it didn't really, in fact, impact the operational technology side of the house and those systems, but out of abundance of caution, Colonial Pipeline shuts that down. These sort of nuanced distinctions caused a lot of panic. I was living in Baltimore at that time, and I remember, seeing scenes on the news of, people pulling up to gas stations thinking that gas is going to run out with trash cans, plastic trash cans, and putting gasoline in plastic trash cans, or putting gasoline in plastic bags and whatnot, right? Created this sort of panic. So there's been a lot of discussion and some case studies written around that, right? And it just sort of hammers home some of these points, that I'm trying to elucidate. The risks as IT and operational technology systems merge and are ever more connected. The risks to critical infrastructure become, sort of increased, if you will, right? Imagine you can compromise a system on an IT network and then from there be able to jump and try to get to systems that manage physical processes and critical infrastructure. And then of course with Ukraine, so there's going back now 6 years, Russia started to experiment with combining kinetic warfare capability, tanks and troops and missiles with cyber capability, going back to 2015, 2016. And they were practicing on the Ukraine and Georgia, former Soviet states, part of the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republics. And Russia has a very sophisticated hacking capability. They're one of our adversaries, and they're very sophisticated and very capable when it comes to hacking critical infrastructure. And they used a novel software and novel techniques, and they used the Ukraine going back to 2015, 2016 as a test bed of their capability. Foreign states like the United States and Israel and our allies knew this was happening, and sort of, it was kind of one of these things like, well, that's happening over there, so, okay, it's not, happening here. Well, fast forward now with the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, and, Russia's had a chance 6 years to sort of hone their craft, if you will, and carry out various cyber attacks against government systems, civilian systems, you name it, right? And, so doing things like bringing down critical IT and operational technology systems, literally either disable them, destroy them, cripple them, make the data or the systems unavailable or not usable, and then back that up with some sort of a kinetic element, missiles, tanks, troops, right? And that happened actually in the first hours of the conflict. It came out afterwards that Russia had found a weakness in satellite systems that were used for much of Ukrainians' communications, and the Russians were able to actually, in this case, destroy the software running on those satellites, and it crippled Ukrainians' ability to communicate internally. Right before Russia decides then to bring in, right, tanks and troops and whatnot. So this sort of converging of kinetic with cyber, and has has a 5 or 6 year history in Russia and Ukraine, right? And real implications for what does that mean for other countries, right? Obviously, the Russian and U.S. relationships are they're strained. And so what does that mean, right? And there's a lot of really smart, good people paying attention to that stuff. If this sounds sort of interesting, you like to dig a little deeper, there's a book, let me get the exact title. It's Sandworm. The book, not Sandworm. It is a reference to Dune. Sandworm, A New Era of Cyber War and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. It came out in 2019, but it does a deep dive into what I was talking about, right? This sort of the beginnings of this combination of software being written to attack operational technology systems, industrial control systems, and it talks about not in addition to Russia and Ukraine, a very famous one going back to 2010, Stuxnet, which was software written by Israeli and U.S. Folks that was designed to speed up the speed at which Iranian centrifuges would try to enrich plutonium. And the Iranians couldn't figure it out. These centrifuges kept spinning up. So in essence, what it was a piece of software on a USB drive that a spy effectively was able to insert into a computer that was controlling these centrifuges in Iran. And it just increased the speed of those centrifuges enough that those things would spin faster than designed, and they would essentially break. And the Iranians couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. Turned out it was really one of the first that we know about pieces of malicious software designed, in this case, to destroy an operation technology system, a system designed to control, amongst other things, the speed of centrifuges. And it's purported that act of destruction set back Iran's capability to enrich plutonium by a couple years, right? And it was one of these first sort of cyber pieces of malicious software, if you will, against an operational technology system. And so Sandworm is a really interesting read into not only Stuxnet, but really more sort of an eye into what was Russia doing as far back as 2015, and how does that have implications now for some of the current conflict that's going on. So it's a lot of me talking. I'll stop there. Winter said that's a great read. Highly recommend for anyone interested in critical information in the state of cybersecurity warfare. Yeah, and he's got a new book coming out soon. So Andy Greenberg, I'll put the title in the chat here. If I can type and talk at the same time. There we go.
So,
Okay.
Casey, we can open it up to questions if anyone has any questions. And the one thing with, what this week is focusing on in terms of getting momentum for young people to go into this part of cybersecurity. What kind of training and certifications would you recommend for young people that want to go into this branch of cybersecurity?
That's a great question. So certainly it helps to have some sort of an IT background, even though the systems perhaps have different business drivers on the operational technology side of the house. Much of the technology is the same. You have computers, and those computers have hardware, and so understanding those hardware and how do the systems used to control a physical process in a manufacturing plant, for example. How do those systems talk to each other? How are they networked? And there are rules around which those systems talk. And so you should, having some basic understanding of how systems communicate and the software running on the systems. And then, and some of the basics of cybersecurity. What's a threat? What's a vulnerability? What's an exploit? Risk management, right? The kinds of courses you could take in high school, for example, might be like a hardware class or a software class or a system administration class, or I know the Cisco networking curriculum is popular. CompTIA, CompTIA, those certifications and or courses tied with those are exactly the kinds of things that provide a really solid, if you will, technical foundation. And then having some understanding of the critical infrastructure itself can be helpful, although not necessarily a requirement. I mean, I know that organizations in the industrial control system space or the critical infrastructure space, they're clamoring for people. And so they'll take people who have an interest and perhaps even an aptitude with some of the technology, and they'll train them on how they do wastewater treatment, or how they manage their gas pipelines, or how they manage their windmills, for example. So those are sort of a couple, I think, ways in which to answer that question. Are there others?
Yeah, you mentioned Sandworm, but you also mentioned another book. I didn't get the name of it. Could you also put that in the chat, or did I misread you? It was only Sandworm that you said was a good read.
Yeah, only Sandworm, but let me find the Stuxnet one. Thanks for that. So I'll put the other one in the chat. Countdown to Zero Day that was written by Kim Zetter, Zetter. And that does a deep dive into, I guess, what some folks call the world's first digital weapon. I don't know. That seems sort of, the weapon and war. I mean, these are terms that they get misused a lot. The Chinese hacking into the U.S. Department of Defense to steal fighter pilot plans, that Lockheed Martin is developing is not cyber war. That's espionage, that's right applied to the cyber realm. So you have to be careful in some of these terms, but Countdown to Zero Day, Kim Zetter, that's a really good one. And that does a deep dive into this Stuxnet, which was a worm. It was it was designed to put back Iran's nuclear program, and was extremely sophisticated. It included not only a cyber element, malicious software designed to target a specific computing system that controlled centrifuges, so it required a lot of technical know-how of the software of that specific system, and then to be able to look for weaknesses in that. But it included other sorts of tradecraft, spies to actually have access to the Iranian facilities where they could literally take a thumb drive with that malicious software and plug it into the appropriate computer. I mean, there's all this sort of really interesting stuff that, is sort of the realm of movies, but, actually really, really happens. So that's another great read if you want to sort of look at this this sort of cybersecurity applied to operational technology and industrial control systems.
I'm gonna, okay, hold on. Casey, this is Morgan. One of the things I was going to ask, because I know you talked about the different skills, could you talk about some of the scholarship opportunities, through, that you've been involved in, that, we've been involved in, so that the teachers can start planting seeds with this student, because the critical infrastructure area is screaming for people, and there are lots of opportunities here. So can you touch on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. Good to see you, Morgan. So the National Science Foundation for, I don't know, 20 years, I guess, has funded a program called Scholarship for Service, SFS. And if you Google National Science Foundation Scholarship for Service, you'll get information. This is open to, right now, four-year schools, although there's some pilots going on with community colleges. So the four-year schools working with local area community colleges apply to the National Science Foundation to get this scholarship money. And then what they do is they make some number of scholarships available to undergraduate and graduate students, and they can major in, it doesn't have to be technical disciplines. Certainly those students can major in computer science or information technology or information systems, but they can major in other disciplines, chemistry, math, business administration, any discipline that's got some connection to cybersecurity, which is essentially almost every single one, right? And so the scholarship is typically a full ride scholarship. So it includes room and board, a really nice stipend, upwards of I don't know, $35,000. So students can focus on their studies full time. It has money for professional development. So if the student wants to go to a conference or they want to go take some sort of training course by a commercial training organization, it includes money for them to buy a laptop. And these scholarships are good for 1, 2, 3 years. They're also available to these community college students and these community colleges that are partnering with the four-year schools. Obviously, there are different line items available because the community college students, for example, don't live on campus, right? So there isn't a living portion, right, for example. But in exchange for the scholarship, then, the service component is that the student who receives the scholarship has to serve doing cybersecurity work for state, local, tribal, or federal government agency for the number of years that they got the scholarship. So if I get a 2-year scholarship, once I graduate with my bachelor's in whatever, mathematics or business administration with the focus on, risk management with the focus on cybersecurity, whatever it is, then I have to serve a state, local, tribal, or federal government agency for 2 years. So that program is well established. It's really sort of the biggest one in this space. Local schools, 2 and 4-year schools, may have scholarships available through endowments or monies that alumni and friends of the college or university have left, so you can look into those. But that's the big one, Morgan. The other thing I would say for the folks in the room is that there is not only is there a huge demand for cybersecurity folks and critical infrastructure, there's just a huge demand for cybersecurity jobs, period. There's about 715,000 open positions right now in the US. And one thing I would really, really stress is that folks can work in cybersecurity and not be technical. There's this sort of misnomer that, you have to have a computer science background to work in tech, especially cyber. And that's, that's not really true. Certainly computer science is one route, but you don't have to have a major in computer science. You don't even have to have a major in IT. More and more business programs, psychology programs, you name it, the various sort of colleges or schools within a four-year school, for example, but even two-year schools, right? They're embedding cybersecurity in more and more disciplines across the curriculum, if you will. And so if somebody's got a passion for law and they want to combine that with cybersecurity, or somebody wants to go into business, or they want to do, accounting. I mean, auditing is a huge cottage industry within cybersecurity, and right, and accountants naturally can fill those kinds of roles, auditing. Folks that want to do more, perhaps they're passionate about teaching, right? Education and training is a huge part in organizations, training and making users aware of risks, to the organization, and trying to teach them effective practices to help folks keep their organization safe. That's a huge portion. There's compliance stuff, federal sort of regulations that require organizations to be in compliance with certain practices. That's a huge piece. Risk management, policies and procedures, human resources, right? These are all huge, critical portions of the larger field of cybersecurity, where folks don't necessarily have to have a technical background. I mean, it certainly helps. It absolutely helps. Just like it helps technical people to understand risk and be able to think through how to model risk of their systems, for example. It's very challenging to get technical people to think about some of the more, I don't like the term soft skills because it implies that they're sort of less than technical, right? But some of the more non-technical oriented skills like risk management, for example. It's, very, very difficult to get technical people to sort of think through, have a risk mindset. I mean, in mature organizations, risk drives everything. It's not the bits and the bytes, that stuff that the techies want to do. It's prioritizing risk to organizations, and then making sure you have the appropriate defenses and resources and whatnot to defend those systems, right? And so that's one takeaway, if there's anything from my ramblings on here, is that there are lots of pathways for students into cybersecurity that don't require them to be technical.
I just had a question. So this SFS, is it just for undergrad students or even high school students?
Not high school, undergrad and graduate. I don't honestly know of any scholarship programs for high school students at a national level, short of, I'm sorry.
High schooler is going into undergrad program, that works?
That's correct. So the high schooler graduates from high school and they go either to a 2 or a 4-year school. The school has to have applied to the National Science Foundation to get this scholarship, but I'm pretty sure I'll put the, let me find the, let's see if I can make this easy and put the URL into the Teams chat here. There you go. There's the link to the Scholarship for Service program. And they've got, let's see, academia. I'll see if I can find a link somewhere. I don't want to take time now, but see if I can find, or if there's a link somewhere on that page that shows the current schools who have this money from National Science Foundation. But again, it's also, there are 2-year schools who have these scholarships too. They're much fewer numbers, but National Science Foundation has opened this program to 2-year schools as well. It used to just be available only to 4-year schools. And I know that 2-year schools can be really attractive for high school students as well. Honestly, the biggest thing that sort of separates the 2- and 4-year schools in the space is, generally speaking, that the 2-year schools tend to be more applied, right? So they're more focused on sort of skills that learners can parlay into getting a job. I don't mean to imply that 4-year schools aren't focused on that, right? But they, they tend to be, have different sort of goals there. Morgan posted something. NSA hires school students for work study internships and scholarships.
Yeah, Casey, this is a really good program, the Stokes Educational Scholarship. And I put the link in there for getting students interested in this. There's another program, and I haven't had a chance to look it up again. It is a co-op program, cooperative education program that the NSA has with, once the high school kids see what it's about, they can start a co-op program. And what that basically means is that they can go to school for a year and then take a quarter or semester off and go to the NSA in Maryland and live there and work as a real employee. Then they go back to school, they learn more, and then they go back again to the NSA. And the woman who told me about this, Sally's with the cryptological department there, and her son, when he graduated college, started as a GSA 9 because of all of the work he had done through co-op education at the NSA. But that does mean, moving to Maryland for a period of time, they put you up in housing that you pay for because you're a paid employee, but you get these skills at the level that you are in school. So this is a graduated way that people can do this.
Thank you for that. Great resource. John Avery, you have your hand up? Can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Just had a quick question about just go with it. Just go with it. All right, just had a quick question about, do they have job placement or support for that afterwards? We had an event in the 90s in Colorado where they offered scholarships like this, but then there weren't jobs available. So students were left holding the bag on this scholarship program and having to repay the loans because they couldn't get a job in public service.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the placement rate for the scholarship for service program is something crazy like, I don't know, 98% or something. So the schools are really effective at placing their students in various state, local, tribal, or federal government agencies, primarily because the program is going on 20 plus years old. So it's well known, right? But I think your mileage will vary with other scholarships, honestly. It just depends on what sort of student support services that the 2 or 4 year school has, right? So I will, full disclosure, I mean, one of the challenges in this space is that while there's a huge number of openings, there aren't a lot of entry-level cybersecurity jobs, right? So it's hard. Most of the job openings tend to be at the intermediate advanced level of the sort of end of the sort of spectrum, right? And so that can be a challenge. And so one effective, I think, strategy, especially for folks coming out of high school who are perhaps younger and may not have a lot of real world experience, is to try to do something in IT first. Help desk, system administration, junior system administrator, hardware support. There are any number of entry-level IT jobs that younger folks can get to get experience, right? And then from there, it's a lot easier to start moving into cybersecurity pathways as opposed to, I have no experience and I hear there's all of these jobs in cyber. There are very few pathways for somebody like that. So that's sort of I think, an effective strategy. Thanks, John. And looks like
Morgan, for some reason, I'm not able to access the chat at all. I don't know if it was disabled or I'm not sure because I tried everything, but I can't see the chat.
Sure. The only thing I posted in there were just the names of a couple books. Countdown to Zero, Sandworm.
And I was looking for the scholarship thing too.
It's called National Science Foundation Scholarship for Service.
We can make all of that information available to everyone. In fact, those are going to be some of the resources that we will make available through through the Google Drive that we're setting up for everyone. And Casey, I know that situation about when NSF was very young, or if there's some challenges to finding the placements. Another scholarship that I would recommend, but this is for people who are at least in their sophomore going into their junior year, is the Department of Defense Scholarship for Service Program. And the reason that this is even more preferable is that they now have a new online tool, and the student goes through the school, but they also set up an application online, and a Department of Defense agency reviews their packet. And if they are selected by that agency, they have a job waiting for them. It's exactly the same thing as the SFS scholarship, except they have an application, they have a job waiting. They get to do an internship program. And then for the students who are not selected, their name goes into the Department of Defense database. And that makes them more visible to these government agencies.
Great.
And we'll get you more information about that as the summer summit goes on.
Very great. And I
Thank you so
did
much,
I
Morgan.
did post a URL to that, Morgan. Thank you for that. John, did you have another question, or are you good to go? Good to go. Okay. Well, I've got 1 minute. I mean, I hope this was worthwhile, and there are a couple nuggets folks can take away.
Casey, there were a lot of nuggets that people were able to take away. All of the things that the books you were recommending, there's one additional book that we'll mention in class, is Lights Out by Ted Koppel. Yeah. And that was written in 2015. And it really gives you, if you could imagine what it means by when they say lights out. When we were doing an Emerald Downs meeting of many critical infrastructures, the different groups were arguing about who was the most important. And then the people from the power group said, try operating without electricity.
Yeah, seems like it all sort of starts there, right? You know, when you think about, I mean, obviously all of the critical infrastructures are clearly important, right? They've been defined. Without them, right, you don't necessarily have a functioning civil society, but it's sort of almost all of them hinge on having reliable and available electricity. So, you know, it's sort of maybe trumps the others in some way, right? You know, I don't know.
They're pretty. It's pretty important because for our way of life, we really need a cyber secure system or systems. So, Casey, this has been a wonderful conversation. Oh, by the way, next year we're planning on seeing you here in Seattle for the NICE conference.
Nice.
Okay.
No pun intended.
Yeah, and I'm hoping you're planning on being here. And I'm going to get back in touch with you with our conversation about profiling critical infrastructure workers. What makes good ones?
Thanks
Okay.
for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everybody, undo your camera for just a second so he can see that we really are a lot of people. Did he leave? The same thing. There he goes. Yeah. Undo your cameras. Come on. Don't be anonymous. Excuse the pun.
Good to see you all. Keep up the good work.
Well, we're going to
Thank you,
hopefully have more
Casey.
people.
Thanks for having me, Winter.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
It was great to
Bye
see you
all.
again. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.